The auction of the wild woman. The market was crowded. People shouted. Vendors sold strange goods, and the air smelled of oil, metal, and alien spices. It was not an ordinary market. It was an auction for rare and exotic beings. On the large stage, bright lights shone down as the announcer spoke through a loudspeaker. Ladies and gentlemen, gather around. You are about to witness something you have never seen before, the announcer declared. The crowd murmured with curiosity. They had seen many strange creatures in this auction. Rare aliens, forgotten species, even legendary warriors. But today, something different was being presented. 2 armored guards dragged a woman onto the stage. She was tall, strong, and wild-looking. Her long, dark hair was tangled, her body covered in strange tribal markings. Her feet were bare, and her piercing green eyes burned with fury. She did not look afraid. She looked like a beast ready to attack. The crowd gasped. "She is human," someone whispered. "Impossible. No human looks like that." The announcer smiled. "Ah, I see your shock. But yes, she is human. At least she was. This woman comes from a lost Earth colony, a planet abandoned centuries ago, a place where humans became wild to survive. She is the last of her kind." The woman growled like an animal. She pulled against the metal cuffs on her wrists, but the guards held her down. "She is dangerous," a bidder in a red cloak said. "She is valuable," another whispered. The announcer laughed. "Yes, she is both. A true warrior from the forgotten past. A fighter. A survivor. Imagine the possibilities. She could be trained, studied, or turned into the greatest gladiator the universe has ever seen. But only one of you will own her." The bidding began. 50,000 credits, a man in a black uniform shouted. 70,000, a green-skinned alien added. 100,000. The numbers climbed higher and higher. The woman still struggled, her eyes scanning the crowd. She did not understand the words, but she understood what was happening. They were selling her. Her breathing grew heavy. The metal cuffs burned against her skin, but she did not stop pulling. If she could break free, she would fight until the last breath. Then a voice from the back of the room spoke. 1,000,000 credits. Silence. The crowd turned to look. A man stood alone. He wore a dark cloak, his face hidden under the hood. His voice was calm, powerful, and final. Even the announcer hesitated. "Oh, 1,000,000. Do I hear a higher bid?" No one answered. The amount was too high. The announcer cleared his throat. "Sold." To the man in the cloak. The wild woman's breathing stopped for a second. Who was this man? Why had he bought her? The guards pulled her forward, shoving her toward her new owner. The man did not flinch. She lunged at him. The crowd gasped. Her hands were still chained, but she moved fast, trying to bite, kick, and strike. The guards held her back, but she fought like a wild animal. The man did not move. He simply watched her with an unreadable expression. Then, slowly, he spoke. "You are not an animal." She froze. The words were simple, but there was something strange about them. They did not sound like an insult. They sounded like a truth she had forgotten. The guards pulled her away, forcing her toward the waiting ship. The auction was over. But her story had just begun. The untamed prisoner. The cold, metallic walls of the spaceship hummed softly as it drifted through space. Inside the cargo hold, in a dimly lit containment cell, the wild woman sat motionless. Her hands and feet were still bound in high-tech energy cuffs, glowing faintly as they restricted her movement. The cuffs were designed for dangerous creatures, preventing escape even from the strongest prisoners. She did not struggle anymore. Not because she had given up. No, she was waiting. Her sharp green eyes watched every detail of her surroundings. She saw the steel walls, the locked doors, the flickering lights of security cameras. She listened to the hum of the ship's systems, the footsteps in the corridors, the voices outside her cell. Every sound, every movement was a clue. She would not be caged forever. The man who bought her. Outside the cell, Captain Jackson stood with his arms crossed. He was watching her through a reinforced glass window, studying her carefully. "She's not like any human I've ever seen," a crew member muttered beside him. "More like a wild beast." Jackson didn't reply immediately. He had seen many things in his life: warriors, assassins, even genetically modified super soldiers. But this woman was something else. There was no fear in her, no submission. Even in chains, she sat like a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. "She's more than a wild beast," Jackson finally said. "She's a survivor." His voice was calm, but inside, his mind raced with questions. Who was she? How did she end up on that auction stage? What happened to her colony? More importantly, why did he feel like he had seen those tribal markings before? The first attempt to communicate. Jackson took a deep breath and pressed the button to open the cell door. A faint hissing sound filled the air as the door slid open. He stepped inside, careful not to make any sudden movements. The woman's eyes locked onto him immediately. Her body tensed, muscles coiled like a spring. Jackson slowly removed the hood of his cloak, revealing his rugged face, short dark hair, and piercing blue eyes. He was not a man of many words, but he knew how to read people. "You understand me?" he asked, his voice calm. She didn't respond. He tried another language, then another. Still, no reaction. Finally, he took a step closer and pointed to himself. "Jackson." Silence. He pointed at her. "You?" The woman narrowed her eyes. Then, after a long moment, she spoke for the first time. A single word. A name. Kayla. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. She remembers her name. That's a start. But before he could say anything else, she lunged. The failed escape. Jackson had expected it. The moment she spoke, her muscles tensed. She had used the name as a distraction. She moved like a blur, slamming into him with surprising force. The cuffs on her wrists should have held her back, but she used them as weapons, swinging them at his face like blunt objects. Jackson barely dodged in time. He grabbed her arm, twisting it slightly to force her down, but she countered with a swift kick to his leg. He stumbled back. She was fast, too fast. She used the moment to bolt toward the door, moving with the agility of a trained hunter. But just before she could escape, a red force field activated, blocking her path. She crashed into it with full force. A bright shock of energy pulsed through her body, sending her to the ground. The crew outside stared in shock. "She's insane," one of them shouted. Jackson didn't move. He watched as Kayla slowly pushed herself up, her breathing heavy. She had been so close. She had almost made it, but she wasn't done yet. Even on the floor, even in pain, she lifted her head and stared at him. Not with fear, not with anger, with defiance, a silent promise. "I will not stay here." Jackson sighed and pressed a button on his wrist device. The force field disappeared, and 2 guards rushed inside to secure her. But before they could touch her, Jackson held up a hand. "No." The guards hesitated. "Captain." "I said no." Jackson crouched down, meeting Kayla's gaze. "You're not a slave," he said quietly. "I didn't buy you to lock you up." Her eyes flickered, a brief moment of confusion crossing her face. Then, "Why?" she whispered. Jackson didn't answer. Not yet, because he didn't fully know the answer himself. The mystery deepens. Later that night, Jackson sat alone in his private quarters, staring at a holographic screen filled with ancient records. He had searched for any mention of Earth's lost colonies, looking for something, anything, that could explain who Kayla was. Then he found it. An old forgotten file. Project Amazon, a classified mission. A human colony left to die on an unknown planet centuries ago. Jackson's heart pounded as he scrolled through the file. The markings on Kayla's body, they were not random. They were symbols from a long-lost warrior clan meant to protect the colony. His fingers clenched into fists. She wasn't just any survivor. She was meant to be a leader, a protector. Then, a final line of text flashed on the screen. Status: classified. All records erased. No survivors expected. Jackson exhaled sharply. Someone had known about this colony. Someone had abandoned them on purpose. And now, the last living member of that forgotten world was on his ship. Outside in the cell, Kayla sat in the darkness. She could feel it in her bones. Her fight was far from over. The hunt across the ship. The spaceship hummed with a steady rhythm, drifting through the endless darkness of space. But inside, chaos had just begun. The ship's alarm blared loudly, red emergency lights flashing across the metal corridors. Security personnel ran through the halls, their weapons ready. "She's loose," one of the crew members shouted. She escaped from the cell. Captain Jackson stood near the ship's control room, watching the security feed. His expression remained unreadable, but inside, he was impressed. Kayla had managed to escape faster than expected. The Great Escape. 30 minutes earlier, Kayla had sat in her containment cell, staring at the walls, observing, thinking. The ship was advanced, but no prison was perfect. The force field was strong, but it relied on energy pulses that flickered every 4.7 seconds. She had counted them. The guards followed a routine, switching shifts exactly every 15 minutes. And most importantly, the air vents were small, but not too small. She had spent her entire life hunting, surviving, and escaping. No metal walls would keep her trapped for long. When the new guard arrived and deactivated the force field to enter the cell, she made her move. In one swift motion, she used the energy cuffs against him, swinging them into his jaw with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the floor. Before the other guards could react, she rolled forward, grabbed his keycard, and sprinted for the exit. The door slid open. The alarms blared, but she was already gone. Now the hunt begins. Jackson watched the live security footage. Kayla moved through the ship like a shadow, silent and deadly. She did not run wildly. She hunted her path carefully. She avoided the main corridors, sticking to the vents and blind spots of the security cameras. "She's too smart," the ship's first officer muttered. "We need to corner her." Jackson smirked. Good luck with that. He had fought trained assassins before. Kayla moved better than them. His communicator buzzed. "Sir, she was last seen in engineering, but now." "She's not in engineering anymore," Jackson interrupted. He zoomed in on the camera feed. No footprints. No trace. She's leading you in circles. The predator in the dark. Kayla crouched in the ventilation shaft, listening. The voices of the crew echoed through the hallways. She can't be far. Check the lower levels. She remained completely still. Back in the jungle, she had learned one thing. Patience was the greatest weapon. The ship's layout was confusing, but not impossible. She had already memorized the sections. She needed weapons. She needed a way to escape. She dropped silently from the vent into a dark storage room. Weapons, food, supplies, everything she needed. She grabbed a small blade, cutting the restraints on her wrists. The metal cuffs fell to the floor. Kayla closed her eyes, breathing deeply. For the first time in years, she felt free. But it wasn't over yet. Jackson's move. "Where is she now?" the first officer demanded. The security feeds flickered. The cameras weren't damaged. They were being hacked. "She disabled the surveillance in storage," Jackson said. "She's arming herself." He sighed and cracked his knuckles. "I'll handle this myself." He didn't take guards, didn't take weapons. He just walked. The confrontation. Kayla heard the footsteps long before she saw him. Slow, calm, controlled. Jackson. She waited in the shadows, blade in hand. He stepped into the storage room, his hands at his sides, showing he was not armed. A bold move. "I know you're here," he said, his voice steady. "You can try to kill me if you want." Silence. Kayla did not strike immediately. She watched him, studied him. No fear, no aggression, just understanding. "Why did you buy me?" she finally asked, her voice sharp. Jackson exhaled. "Because you're more than what they said you were." She narrowed her eyes. "Then what am I?" Jackson met her gaze. "A survivor, a fighter, and someone who deserves to know the truth." Kayla gripped the blade tightly. She wanted to believe him, but trust was dangerous. She took a slow step forward. "Then prove it." Jackson smirked. "I will." But before he could say another word, the ship shook violently, alarms blaring once again. They were under attack. Kayla's escape was no longer the biggest problem. Someone was coming for her, and they didn't plan to take her alive. The truth about Earth's lost colony. The spaceship shook violently, alarms blaring through every corridor. The red emergency lights cast long shadows on the walls, flickering like dying stars. They were under attack. Jackson barely had time to react before his communicator buzzed with frantic voices. "Captain, unidentified warship approaching at high speed. They're not responding to hails. They locked onto our ship, preparing to board." Jackson's jaw tightened. He turned to Kayla, who was still gripping the stolen blade. Her green eyes burned with intensity, scanning the room as if she could sense the enemy even before the sensors picked them up. "You know who they are, don't you?" Jackson asked. Kayla didn't answer, not with words. But her silence said everything. The warship of ghosts. In the control room, the crew worked furiously, analyzing the enemy ship. The screen displayed a massive black warship, sleek and deadly, with no known markings or identification codes. It moved silently, like a predator stalking its prey. "They're fast," the first officer muttered. "Too fast for a standard warship." Jackson stared at the screen. His gut told him something was very wrong. "They're coming for her," he said finally. "Why?" Jackson exhaled. "That's what I'm about to find out." He turned and headed back to Kayla, time running out with each step. Kayla's truth. Kayla sat in the dim storage room, gripping her knife tightly. The moment she saw the enemy ship on the screen, she had recognized it. She had seen ships like that before, long ago. Her memories were still fractured, like broken glass, but she remembered flashes of the past. The sounds of screaming, the smell of burning jungle, the feeling of metal restraints cutting into her skin. And above all, she remembered the symbol, a black insignia worn by the soldiers who had come to her planet and destroyed everything. The ones who had abandoned her people. The ship shook again. This time, the explosion was closer. The enemy was forcing them to land. Jackson entered the room. "You need to tell me what's going on." Kayla's breath was unsteady. "They came before." Jackson frowned. "Who?" She clenched her fists. "The people who left us behind. The people who made sure no one ever found us." Jackson narrowed his eyes. "Made sure?" Kayla looked up at him, her face unreadable. Then she said the words that made Jackson's blood run cold. "My colony wasn't lost," she whispered. "It was erased. Project Amazon, the hidden truth." Jackson knew Kayla wasn't lying. He had already seen hints of the truth in the classified files he found earlier. Now, the pieces were starting to come together. Hundreds of years ago, Earth had sent experimental colonies to far-off planets, trying to see if humans could adapt to different environments. Project Amazon was one of them. A human settlement sent to an untamed jungle planet, a planet with no technology, no outside resources. The mission was simple: survive, evolve, adapt. But something had gone wrong. The record showed no rescue missions, no further contact, as if the colony had been abandoned on purpose. And now someone was still trying to keep it buried. Jackson clenched his fists. They never meant for anyone to know about your people. Kayla's expression hardened. No, they wanted us dead. And now they had come to finish the job. Boarding party. The warship latched onto Jackson's vessel, sending shockwaves through the ship. They're forcing entry, the voice shouted over the intercom. The crew scrambled into position, weapons drawn. The air was thick with tension. Jackson grabbed his sidearm and turned to Kayla. You want revenge? Kayla's grip tightened on her blade. I want justice. Jackson smirked. Then let's give them hell. The battle for the truth. The enemy soldiers stormed into the ship, faceless, armored warriors moving with brutal efficiency. Their weapons glowed with high-energy plasma, firing in precise bursts. But Kayla was faster. She moved like a shadow, darting between the soldiers, striking with deadly precision. The knife in her hand found its mark again and again. She wasn't just fighting, she was hunting. Jackson covered her, taking down enemies with clean headshots. The crew held their ground, but they were outnumbered. The enemy wasn't here to capture. They were here to eliminate. We can't win this, the first officer shouted. Jackson growled. We don't need to win. We just need to get her out of here. Kayla dodged a plasma shot, flipping over a crate, landing with predator-like grace. Her instincts told her something was wrong. Then she saw him, a tall figure in dark armor, standing at the far end of the corridor. He didn't move. He didn't fire a weapon. He just watched her. Kayla froze. Something about him felt familiar. Then the armored figure spoke. His voice was distorted by the helmet, but the words made Kayla's heart stop. It's been a long time, Kayla. She stepped back. No, it couldn't be. Jackson looked at her, then at the soldier. Who is he? Kayla's hands trembled. She knew that voice. She knew who he was. He was the reason her people had been abandoned. And now he was back to end it for good. The betrayal and the great escape. The corridor was filled with smoke, the air thick with the scent of burning metal and plasma fire. The emergency lights flickered, casting eerie red glows over the chaos. Kayla stood frozen, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The armored figure at the end of the hallway tilted his head slightly, his helmet reflecting the flickering flames. It's been a long time, Kayla. His voice sent a cold shiver down her spine. Jackson narrowed his eyes, gripping his weapon tightly. Who the hell is this guy? Kayla barely whispered the answer. He's the one who betrayed my people. Jackson's jaw clenched. That changed everything. Memories of fire and betrayal. Kayla's mind raced back to the past. She was just a child when they came. The colony had survived for decades, building a life in the untamed jungle world. Her people had grown stronger, their bodies adapting, their instincts sharpening. They had become something more than human. Fast, strong, resilient. They had made the planet their home. Then the warships arrived. They came under the banner of rescue. They promised aid, supplies, and technology. But it was a lie. They weren't rescuing them. They were erasing them. She remembered the fire, the screams, the soldiers in black armor, cutting down anyone who resisted. She had watched her mother fall, struck down by a plasma rifle. And standing among the invaders, watching without emotion, was him, the man who now stood before her. Commander Voss, the one who had given the order to burn her people to the ground, the one who had left her for dead. Back to the present, a deadly standoff. Kayla's fists clenched, rage burning through her veins like wildfire. Voss took a slow step forward. His soldiers held their weapons ready, waiting for his signal. You were supposed to be dead, he said, his voice almost amused. Kayla's fingers twitched over the handle of her stolen blade. I survived. Voss chuckled. Yes, you always were, different from the others. Jackson was done listening. He stepped in front of Kayla, his gun aimed directly at Voss's helmet. "I don't know who you are, but you're not leaving this ship alive." Voss didn't even flinch. "You misunderstand, Captain," he said smoothly. "I have no interest in your crew. I only want her." His soldiers raised their weapons in unison. Jackson's grip tightened. "Not happening." Voss sighed. "A pity." And then, all hell broke loose. The battle against Voss's forces. Voss's soldiers opened fire. Plasma blasts scorched the walls, tearing through metal and sending debris flying. Jackson tackled Kayla behind a supply crate, just as a wave of energy bolts burned through the spot where she had been standing. "Move," he shouted, firing back. Kayla didn't need to be told twice. She was already in motion, flipping over the crate and rushing toward the enemy like a storm. The first soldier never saw her coming. She grabbed his rifle and used it against him, twisting it under his own arm and firing at his ally before kicking him into a wall. Jackson cursed under his breath. "I'll never get used to how fast she is." The ship's crew fought hard, but they were outnumbered. Voss's forces were too well trained, too well equipped. Jackson realized something horrifying. Voss wasn't trying to kill Kayla. He was testing her, seeing if she was still the same warrior from the past. And worse, he was enjoying it. The betrayal. Suddenly, the ship lurched, sending everyone crashing to the floor. "What the hell was that?" Jackson shouted. His communicator crackled. "Captain, someone disabled the ship's engines." Jackson's blood ran cold. "Who did it?" A long silence. Then the answer came. It was one of our own. Betrayal. Someone on board had sold them out. Jackson's eyes flicked toward Voss, who remained calm, even as the battle raged around him. "Looks like someone on your crew has a brain," Voss said. Jackson's anger boiled over. "Who?" he growled. "Who betrayed us?" Voss tilted his head. "Why don't you ask your first officer?" Jackson's heart stopped. His own second-in-command stepped forward from the shadows. "Lieutenant Wren, Jackson's most trusted officer," now holding a weapon pointed directly at him. "I'm sorry, Captain," Wren said, his voice cold. "But some things are bigger than loyalty." Kayla's rage exploded. "You sold us out," she roared. Wren didn't flinch. "You don't understand, Kayla. They were never going to let you escape. I just made sure we survived." Jackson's jaw tightened. "You damn coward." Voss smiled. "A practical man. I like that." Jackson moved like lightning, drawing his pistol and firing at Wren. But the traitor was faster. Wren dodged, slamming his elbow into Jackson's ribs and knocking the gun from his hands. Voss seized the moment. He stepped forward and grabbed Kayla by the wrist. Her vision blurred with rage. For the first time in years, she felt trapped. Like a child again. Like prey. No, never again. She twisted violently, breaking free from Voss's grip and driving her knee into his stomach. He stumbled back, more surprised than hurt. And then, Kayla made a deadly decision. She turned to Jackson, her voice sharp and final. "Get your crew off this ship." Jackson's eyes widened. "What?" Kayla grabbed a discarded plasma grenade, her fingers tightening around the trigger. "I'm ending this." Jackson realized too late what she meant. She wasn't planning to run. She was planning to destroy the entire ship, with Voss inside it. The only problem: she might not survive either. The final confrontation. The grenade in Kayla's hand hummed softly, its red light blinking in slow, deadly pulses. Everyone in the room froze. Voss stared at her, his armored form barely shifting. The soldiers beside him held their weapons ready, but they did not fire. They knew what she held. And they knew she wasn't bluffing. The energy pulse grenade wasn't like a normal explosive. It didn't just kill, it erased. A direct detonation could wipe out the entire room, leaving nothing but empty space where flesh and metal had once been. Jackson's heart pounded. "Kayla," he said carefully, stepping forward, Whatever you're thinking. Kayla's gaze never left Voss. I'm thinking, she interrupted, her voice steady, that I should have done this years ago. The standoff. Voss didn't react. If he felt fear, he didn't show it. Instead, he took a slow step forward, ignoring the weapons pointed at him. Go ahead, he said, voice calm. Do it. Kayla's grip tightened on the grenade. Let's see if you have the courage to finally end this, he continued. You've always been a survivor, Kayla. But surviving isn't the same as winning. Her muscles tensed. She could hear the unspoken challenge in his words. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about control. Voss wanted her to kill him. Because if she did, she would become like him. A murderer. A weapon. Kayla hated him for that. For making her doubt. But before she could react, the ship shook violently. The grenade slipped from her grasp. The explosive escape. Get down, Jackson shouted. The grenade hit the floor and detonated. A pulse of white-hot energy erupted from the center of the room. The walls buckled, sparks flying as control panels exploded. Voss was thrown backward, his soldiers scattered like rag dolls. Kayla barely had time to react before Jackson grabbed her and pulled her behind a collapsing metal column. The ship groaned as the explosion ripped through the deck, causing the walls to bend and crack like shattered glass. Emergency sirens blared. Smoke filled the air. Voss's soldiers, what was left of them, scrambled for cover, but the entire warship was now unstable. Jackson's communicator crackled. Captain, we've lost all stabilizers. Jackson cursed. Get to the escape pods. Now. Voss's final move. Through the smoke, Kayla saw him. Voss was still standing. His armor was damaged, his helmet cracked. Blood dripped from a wound on his forehead, but he was alive. And he was laughing. Impressive, he said, brushing blood from his face. You're stronger than I remember. Kayla's fists clenched. Voss took a slow step forward. His soldiers were gone, either dead or fleeing. But he wasn't afraid. Go ahead, he said. Kill me now. Kayla's breathing was uneven. The rage in her veins burned like fire. This was her chance. To end it. To erase him like he had tried to erase her people. She lunged forward, and Jackson stopped her. His hand grabbed her wrist, holding her back. She whirled around, furious. Move. No. Her anger exploded. He deserves to die. Jackson's eyes were steady. Maybe. But not like this. Kayla's breathing was ragged. Every instinct in her body screamed to finish it. But Jackson's words cut through the fury. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for something bigger. Voss wasn't afraid to die. He was waiting for her to do it. She stepped back. You don't deserve an easy death. Voss's smirk faded. Kayla turned and ran. Escape from the warship. The ship was falling apart. Smoke and fire filled every corridor. Jackson and Kayla ran through the twisting metal pathways, dodging collapsing beams and bursts of flames. The walls trembled, the structure failing. Jackson's communicator buzzed. We've launched the escape pods. You've got less than 2 minutes before the ship implodes. Jackson gritted his teeth. We're almost there. Kayla sprinted ahead, moving with the agility of a hunter, leading the way through the crumbling corridors. Then, a blast door slammed shut in front of them, trapping them inside. Jackson cursed. Damn it. He turned to the emergency controls, but the system was dead. And then, the shadows behind them moved. The last fight. Voss wasn't done yet. His figure emerged from the smoke, a plasma blade humming to life in his hands. Kayla turned, her muscles coiling. No words were spoken. This was it. One final fight. Kayla charged first, dodging under his blade and striking fast. Voss countered, his movements calculated and deadly. He wasn't just a brute. He was a trained killer. The battle was fast and brutal. Sparks flew as the plasma blade slashed the air, narrowly missing Kayla's skin. She moved like liquid fury, her instincts sharper than ever. She was not the same girl he had left to die years ago. Voss realized it too late. Kayla wasn't fighting for revenge anymore. She was fighting to live. One final move. She spun, using the broken floor to launch herself into the air, and drove her blade straight into his chest. Voss staggered, blood spilling from his lips. He fell to his knees, his breathing shallow. Kayla stood over him, her eyes cold and steady. For the first time, Voss looked afraid. But Kayla simply whispered, "You don't control me anymore." And then, she left him behind. Freedom. Jackson and Kayla reached the last escape pod. The ship was seconds from imploding. Jackson jumped in first, pulling Kayla with him. The doors sealed shut, and the pod launched into space just as the warship collapsed inward, consumed by fire and destruction. Kayla watched as the wreckage drifted into nothingness. Voss was gone. The warship was gone. Her past was gone. And for the first time in her life, she was truly free. A new beginning. The escape pod drifted through the vast darkness of space. Inside, Kayla sat in silence, staring out at the wreckage of Voss's warship as it slowly disintegrated. The battle was over. The ship that had once held her nightmares, the man who had orchestrated the destruction of her people, all of it was gone. But instead of relief, she felt empty. She had spent her entire life fighting to survive, fighting to escape, fighting to find justice. Now, for the first time, there was nothing left to fight. And that terrified her. The way to freedom. Jackson sat across from her, piloting the pod toward their rendezvous point. His knuckles were bruised, his uniform torn, but his eyes were still sharp, alive. He glanced at her. "You okay?" Kayla didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure how to answer. She had spent years thinking that revenge would bring her peace, that once she saw Voss dead, the fire in her soul would finally fade. But the fire was still there, burning, searching. "I don't know what I am now," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson nodded. He understood. "Then maybe," he said, adjusting the ship's course, "it's time to find out." Kayla turned her gaze back to the stars. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was free. But freedom was a strange thing when you had never truly known it. The arrival at Haven Station. The escape pod shuddered as it entered the atmosphere of a floating city, a massive orbital station known as Haven. It was a place for runaways, rebels, and those seeking the second chance, a place where no one asked questions, and the past didn't define you. As they landed, the ship's hatch hissed open, revealing a busy docking bay filled with people from all across the galaxy. Kayla stepped out cautiously, her instincts still sharp, her body still coiled like a predator expecting a trap. But for the first time, no one was hunting her. She was just another face in the crowd. The realization was almost overwhelming. Jackson patted her shoulder. "Welcome to your new life." Kayla took a deep breath. The air was different here. Not thick with the scent of battle or blood, but something else. Possibility. A choice to make. As they walked through the bustling market of Haven, Jackson led her to a small, dimly lit bar tucked between towering neon buildings. Inside, the hum of quiet conversations filled the air, and the scent of alien spices drifted around them. A woman behind the bar raised an eyebrow. "Jackson, thought you were dead." Jackson smirked. "Almost. Again." The bartender's gaze shifted to Kayla. "And who's this?" Kayla hesitated. Who was she now? She wasn't a lost Amazonian girl from a forgotten colony. She wasn't a prisoner, a savage, or a soldier. She wasn't even a warrior seeking revenge anymore. For the first time in her life, Kayla had the power to choose. She thought about her people, about the colony that had been wiped out. The ghosts of her past would never truly leave her, but maybe she could honor them by building something new. Finally, She met the bartender's gaze and spoke 2 words. Just Kayla. Jackson gave her a small, knowing smile. She was beginning to let go. But before they could settle in, the bartender slid a small holodisc across the counter. "You might want to see this," she said. Jackson frowned, activating the device. A holographic news report flickered to life in front of them. Kayla leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she read the glowing text. The shocking revelation. Breaking NEWS. High-ranking military official commander VOSS presumed dead after warship explosion. Kayla exhaled sharply. Good. But the next line made her blood run cold. However, Niuvu LEDs CGGEST 8 Amazon was just the beginning. Unknown. Human survivors HFY on a Sci-Fi planet. Kayla's heart stopped. Jackson cursed under his breath. Impossible. Kayla's hands trembled as she reached out to rewind the message, reading it again. Unknown human survivors. She looked at Jackson, her voice barely above a whisper. There are more of us. A new mission. Kayla stood up, her mind racing. For years, she thought her people had been completely wiped out. But if there were others, if there was even a chance that someone from her colony had survived, she had to find them. Jackson saw the fire in her eyes. He knew that look. He had seen it before, in soldiers who had lost everything, in rebels who refused to surrender. She wasn't just looking for survivors. She was looking for a purpose. So, Jackson said, leaning back against the bar, what now? Kayla clenched her fists. She had a choice now. And she had already made it. I find them. She turned toward the exit, already planning her next move. She had spent too long running from the past. Now, she was running toward the future. Jackson chuckled and followed. Looks like I'm coming with you. Kayla smirked. Try to keep up. And with that, they vanished into the neon-lit streets, heading toward the unknown. Toward the next chapter of their story.